Welcome to the last video in Be Positively Powerful, Overcoming Trauma Through a Focus on Resilience and Empowerment. This video we will address school-wide trauma-informed practices. The foundation for effective trauma-informed practices is a positive school climate, which raises some significant challenges. How will schools establish a positive school climate after what's been happening in schools because of the pandemic and controversies around equity? The other concern pre-pandemic is that there are really no best practices. We have to start with the recognition that there are no evidence-based best practices for trauma-informed practices in school. While there are a number of publications that describe trauma-informed approaches and advocate for the need for them and the benefit, there's been no rigorous evaluations of trauma-informed approaches in schools that we could find. This is 2019 publication. And another publication that said, despite the interest in trauma-informed schools, there are a few evaluations that document how school strategies to improve school climate affect trauma-related mental health and well-being of students. This is another 2019 study. We are in a situation where we have to look very closely at what the requirements are under ESSA for evidence-based. There are 4 tiers. Tier 1 is strong evidence, well-designed experimental study, doesn't exist. Tier 2, moderate evidence, well-designed quasi-experimental study, doesn't exist. Tier 3, promising evidence, correlation study. Well, there may be some evidence from correlation studies that we can integrate into a program. And Tier 4, research rationale. That is, setting forth with a rationale grounded in research insight with local evaluation. And this is the thinking approach that we need to adopt. This is an article from Brookings that I would strongly encourage you to read. The title is From Evidence-Based Programs to an Evidence-Based System, Opportunities Under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And here's a key statement. Crucially, for many purposes, the law also treats as evidence-based a 4th category that comprises activities that have a research-based rationale but lack direct empirical support, provided that they are accompanied by ongoing efforts to examine the effects of the activity on important student outcomes. Those 6 words, if taken seriously and implemented with care, hold the potential to create and provide resources to sustain a new model for decision-making within state education agencies and school districts, a model that benefits students and taxpayers over time and enhances our knowledge of what works in education. Now, I have focused on this for a very, very long period of time because I've worked in the field of bullying prevention for a very long period of time, and guess what? There are also no evidence-based practices that have documented effectiveness in reducing or responding effectively to bullying. So I first got involved in this when there was this other law called the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. This law required that schools use an evidence-based approach if they were going to use funding from this program. But it allowed for innovative approaches to be implemented if they had a likelihood of success. Now, this is the generation, this is what existed before that is now Tier 4. So the requirements under the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act provide an absolutely top-notch, excellent model. What these requirements included were a needs assessment based on objective data that describes the problems or concerns currently faced by the school. You gotta get data. A description of the performance measure or measures the program or activities would address. A rationale for the program or activity describing how it was designed and why it was expected to be successful in accomplishing the improvements described in the performance measures. A discussion of the most significant risk and protective factors the program or activity has been designed to target. A detailed description of the implementation plan, including a description of how the program or activity would be carried out, the personnel to be involved, the intended audience or target population, and the time frame. A detailed description of all the costs associated with carrying out the program or activity, and, very importantly, an evaluation plan that addresses the methods used to assess progress towards attaining goals and objectives, the personnel who would conduct the evaluation, the way the results of the evaluation would be used to refine and improve and strengthen the district's comprehensive plan, and the way progress towards attaining objectives would be publicly reported. And lastly, evidence to support that the program or activity has a substantial likelihood of success. This should include a description of the prevention research and principles the program is based upon. That's kind of maybe tier 3. A description of the results achieved from a previous implementation of the program or activity in a setting similar to the one the district was proposing, or, if the program has not yet been rigorously evaluated, a description of the plan and timetable for doing so, which was the point before. There is a missing element to this set of guidelines. Too many programs or the research addressing activities has been deemed to be effective in one setting, but may not be effective in other settings with different cultures and climates, especially those that are serving a large number of minority students. So the additional element I would suggest to be added to this list of components that came from the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act is evidence to support the fact that the proposed approach has been developed with an equity lens that fits with the culture of the specific school community and will meet the needs of students with greater challenges within this school community, and evidence that the plan has been developed by a team that includes members of minority communities and in consultation with professionals within that community. So, this is the model that I set forth that I call continuous improvement. And this is an ongoing circle of activities, an annual survey that is analyzed and with additional insight that comes from focus groups. Improvement objectives that are tied to this data. If your survey finds that 30% of your students do not think that any staff member cares about them, then your objective will be that 100% of students know that a staff member really cares about them. And then you have strategies that are developed that are informed by the research and a plan for evaluation of effectiveness, which will be using your annual survey and keeps that going on and on. To accomplish this requires a leadership team that includes educators, students, and parents. So let's just consider what's happened in the last year and a half that could seriously harm school climate into the future. The digital learning environments may have been inequitable, distressful, and ineffective. There was a differential impact of risks, illness, death, and disadvantages primarily on minority and low-income families. The concerns about the loss of learning and that students will be behind could lead to increased pressures for them to catch up. There continues to be significant political and cultural unrest related to ongoing COVID-19 safety needs, racial inequities, and gender orientation and identity. And many educators feel that they were considered expendable and that their health and lives did not matter. However, we do have some positive outcomes. Educators now have a very in-depth understanding of the impact of trauma because they have been experiencing this. The inequities in our schools and communities have become more glaringly evident, and there appears in at least a significant number of environments to be an expanded level of commitment to better address students' emotional well-being and the long-standing concerns of racism and inequities, although we do appear to be having some battles related to this. So the big question is, how can we create a new normal? So to create a new normal, we have to start with an honest acknowledgement of what has not been working. And there are two biggies in this. One is the high-stakes testing that has always been biased and was not working before the pandemic. Here are two North stories. After 10 years of hopes and setbacks, what happened to the Common Core? Higher expectations, flat results. And we have to effectively address the unequal funding and inequitable discriminatory discipline practices, which are well-known concerns within our schools. Why haven't we addressed them? So what are the big issues that we have got to address at the same time we're implementing trauma-informed practices in schools? We need to ensure we have equitable funding for schools, shifting from a reliance on property taxes, which will never be equitable. We need to eliminate the failed, biased, high-stakes tests and shift to an assessment approach that supports student growth. We need to remedy school building infrastructure in many communities, upgrade school facilities. We must increase mental health services and eliminate or significantly reduce police presence in schools. Schools have to have a good connection with local law enforcement, but use funding for increased counselors. And we need to ensure equitable broadband access to ensure all students can access digital resources to support their learning. I keep hearing this phrase, which is absolutely appropriate, Maslow before Bloom. What schools have to focus on to support effective learning are the physiological needs of students and staff, the safety needs of students and staff, the love and belonging needs of students and staff, the esteem needs of students and staff, and when we address those effectively, then we get to the point where effective learning can occur by all students. I did indeed include this slide in the first video, and I'm going to include it here as the hope, acknowledging that we have a significant challenge in getting to this, as evidenced by what's happening in our communities, state legislators, legislative bodies, and elsewhere. So the positive change we can hope to hold on to as a result of experiencing trauma includes an increased sense of personal strength of all members within the school community, a deepening of commitment to the well-being of all members of the school community, closer relationships between all members of the school community, new opportunities and strategies to support all students in achieving success, and a solid commitment to social justice. I mentioned these resources at the beginning, and these are the folks who have the most significant resources for trauma-informed practices in schools. I'm going to go through at a very high level the guidance that has been provided by these organizations, and then seek to pull this together into more of a to-do action plan. So from the CDC, this is not specifically focused on schools, But the key strategies that they recommend is to strengthen economic supports to families so schools can advocate for this in the community, promote social norms that protect against violence and adversity. These are clearly approaches that can be implemented, need to be implemented in schools. Ensuring a strong start for children. Yes, early childhood education is incredibly important. Teaching skills in social emotional learning, safe dating, healthy relationships, parenting skills. These are all activities that schools need to be involved in. Connecting youth to caring adults and activities. Well, they suggest mentoring programs and after-school programs. This has got to be a primary focus within schools. And intervening to lessen immediate and long-term harms. Now, these are approaches that identify when somebody has experienced trauma and ensuring that there is an effective response. The SAMHSA guidance, the concept of trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach. The program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed, now this includes a school, realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization or continued traumatization, I would suggest. Their 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach are to focus on safety of all members or participants in your program, organization, system, or school. Ensure trustworthiness and transparency in the operations of this program, organization, system, or school. Provide peer support, and I think peer support is a real helpful aspect that we need to increase. Ensure collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice. I will constantly talk about voice and empowerment, and address cultural, historical, and gender issues. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has just an incredible amount of resources on trauma. The essential elements of a trauma-informed school that they have identified are these 10. Identifying and assessing traumatic stress, addressing and treating traumatic stress, teaching trauma education and awareness, having partnerships with students and families, creating a trauma-informed learning environment that focuses on social emotional skills and wellness, being culturally responsive, integrating emergency management and crisis response into the trauma-informed approach, understanding and addressing staff self-care and secondary traumatic stress, which I addressed in the 3rd video, evaluating and revising school discipline policies and practices which may produce trauma, and collaborating across systems and establishing community partnerships. The National Center on Safe Supportive Learning Environments also has some comprehensive resources on how to establish trauma-informed schools, or trauma-sensitive schools, they call them. First of all, understanding trauma and its impact. In a trauma-sensitive school, all staff have a common understanding of the impact of trauma on students, families, and staff, and have a joint mission to create an environment that acknowledges and addresses this impact on school staff. A belief that healing happens in relationships. Believe that establishing safe, authentic, and positive relationships can be corrective and restorative to survivors of trauma and help in building resilience for all. And this includes relationships among and between school staff, students, and their families. Ensuring emotional and physical safety. The schools must have be committed to establishing a safe physical and emotional learning environments where basic needs are met, safety measures are put in place, and staff responses are consistent, predictable, and respectful. Viewing students holistically. The understanding the interrelated nature of emotional and physical health and academic success, and viewing students holistically and building skills in all of those areas. Supporting choice, control, and empowerment for students, staff, and family. Again, we have the issue of choice, control, and voice, helping all to achieve mastery. Striving for cultural competence. Acknowledge and respect diversity within the school. Consider the relationship between the cultural traumatic experiences, safety, healing, and resilience, and use approaches that align with the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of students, families, I would add staff, and the broader community. And use a collaborative approach, working with students, families, and staff, sharing power and decision-making across all levels of the school, and seeing students and families, I would add teachers and certified staff and classified staff, as partners. Castle has a somewhat historically interesting document that they created in advance of the 2020-21 school year, when they presumed we were all getting back together in school. So their focus on social emotional learning practices for reopening include: take the time to cultivate and deepen relationships, build partnerships, and plan for social emotional learning. Design opportunities where adults can connect, heal, and build their capacity to support students. Create safe, supportive, and equitable learning environments that promote all students' social and emotional development. And use data, I love them, they talk about data, as an opportunity to share power, deepen relationships, and continuously improve support for students, families, and staff. In evaluating all of these resources for schools, and coming into this from a background in working in bullying prevention for over a decade, unfortunately, relatively unsuccessfully, what I perceived, what was evident, was a bias in the thinking that schools are dealing with trauma that occurred in the home and possibly in the community. And my belief is that the source of this bias was actually the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, where the focus was on adverse experiences in the home. So I would ask you, is it possible to effectively implement trauma-informed practices in schools without effectively stopping the practice of schools that inflict trauma on students? So I would like to provide you with my list of practices that I believe can inflict trauma on students while they are at school. Bullying. Serious, persistent, or pervasive hurtful treatment of students. And denigration of students by school staff. School staff denigrate or exclude certain students, frequently protected class students, minority, marginalized students. Behavior management approaches. Rewards practices that exclude or denigrate students who have greater challenges and are not able to manage their behavior in accord with the expressed standards. School resource officers, the abusive treatment of students. Environmental traumas, classroom environments that frequently do not support the neurodiverse students. Systemic bias, systemic practices that disadvantage minority students. Mislabeling, labeling students who have experienced trauma as behavior disordered. And active shooter drills. These are clearly traumatizing practices. Why are they continuing in this manner? Significant efforts were introduced, especially in 2010, to reduce bullying. So let's look at the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which has asked students whether they've been bullied in schools since 2009. There has been no decline in students' reports of being bullied, and an increase in students reporting that they're not going to school for safety concerns. This is addressed far more completely in my series of videos on bullying, especially engaging students to embrace civility, especially the first video on what's not working in bullying prevention. The vast majority of students who are bullied do not tell an adult. And for those who do, this generally does not make things better. This is research done by the Youth Voice Project and students who were bullied and feeling distressed. Look at those numbers. About 2/3 did not tell an adult. 1/3 of those who told, things got better. For 1/3 of those who told, things stayed the same. And for 1/3 of those who told, things got worse. So we've got about a 10% level of effectiveness in the remember, tell an adult when being bullied, to tell an adult they can help. No, this isn't working. This is data from a survey that I conducted in 2015. This was a national survey of 1,500 middle and high school students. And I tossed a question in that I actually didn't realize the importance of when I put the survey together. I asked students 3 questions around student-on-student hurtful behavior. And I also asked 1 question about how frequently they had witnessed a school staff member be hurtful to students. Notice that 9% of students said they saw a school staff member being hurtful to students almost every day, and 12% said they saw it once or twice a week. 21% said they saw it once or twice a month. Did some analysis then based on the student-on-student hurtful questions, based on whether they had ever witnessed a staff member be hurtful, that's almost every day, once or twice a week, once or twice a month, or never. And the students who had witnessed school staff be hurtful to a student also reported significantly higher levels of student-on-student hurtful behavior. So look at the blue area on these charts. The blue are the percentage of students who said they had never witnessed other students being hurtful, were hurtful, or had a student be hurtful to them. Look at the first line. If they had ever witnessed staff be hurtful, how frequently had they witnessed students be hurtful, were hurtful, or a student was hurtful to them? Then the second line is if they had never witnessed a staff be hurtful, and how they then had never witnessed students be hurtful, never were hurtful, and never had a student hurtful to them. Okay, so the bottom line you should take away from this data is that we can prevent and reduce a lot of the student-on-student hurtful behavior if we would just focus on stopping the staff-on-student hurtful behavior. This is the results of a study from the Chicago Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, what the research shows of the impact of school resource officers. School resource officers are not effective in improving school safety, discipline, or climate. They do not improve school safety or reduce school violence. Students feel less safe and more fearful at schools that have school resource officers. The presence of school resource officers leads to more expulsions and suspensions, particularly for Black students. And schools with school resource officers criminalize and arrest youth for minor misbehavior. The rewards approaches or behavior charts that are used in way too many schools, how do you think it feels to be publicly identified as the red card kid, or to sit in an assembly and watch the students who have no challenges And the thought that this is going to motivate the students who have faced many challenges to act in accord with the school's expectations. If the students who have challenges and have experienced trauma could manage their behavior, they would. And it is imperative that we address the systemic racial bias of schools. This includes the unconscious bias of students or staff, unequal funding of schools that we have somehow accepted as appropriate in our country, discriminatory school discipline, discriminatory harassment of students by other students or staff, the racially biased tests that we are using, discriminatory school choice programs, school resource officer violence against students, the dominant culture version of history, the failure to stop racial harassment, the school-to-prison pipeline, and offensive team names. So I actually have a book on my shelf. It's entitled Savage Inequalities. This was published in 1991. An impassioned book laced with anger and indignation about our public school system scorns so many of our students. And now what we've got is states taking steps to ban critical race theory. How can we be here? How can our society function in this manner? I think we also need to reassess how we are identifying students as behavior disordered. Now, I was a special education teacher of students who were labeled behavior disordered. Every single one of them had, and many were, continuing to experience trauma. What are the examples? What are the symptoms of students who have experienced trauma? A lack of focus, struggles to self-regulate, they're impulsive, they're disruptive, they lack executive functioning, and they have sensory problems. Should this be considered a child with a behavior disorder, that something is wrong with them, or should this be considered a child to whom wrong things have happened? So let's ask ourselves, why are students who are neurologically diverse, they're on the autism spectrum or have attention issues, expected to be able to change their behavior to act in accord with school expectations? What have we learned about these students' experiences with remote instruction? Many of them experienced really significant success because they were better able to control the environment. Can we better create environments and practices in schools that better suit the functioning of these students? Active shooter drills. Yeah, safety is important, but traumatizing students is not the answer. This absolutely has to stop. Now, I've been engaged with a fair number of parents and educators during this experience of remote learning. And what they have all told me is many students who normally experience social anxiety in school, have challenges maintaining their behavior at school, or are typically bullied at school, loved remote learning. They have been able to be more successful because they were not experiencing the adverse environment and hurtful treatment that they normally experience at school. So we need to have a real serious thinking about what's going to happen to these students when they return to school. Here's actually one research article that addressed this. For young people, particularly those with social anxiety disorders, remaining at home and doing online schooling may temporarily relieve their anxiety, but this is not a long-term solution and may result in overwhelming anxiety when it is necessary to return to school. So I want to ask why we have students who have social anxiety when they are at school, and what do we need to do about the school environment to better address this? And that's going to have to relate to how students and staff are treating others. I think it's also important to pay attention to the research on children and teens suicides as they relate to the school calendar. Psychiatric emergencies and youth suicides rise sharply with the school year. Young people think about, attempt, and die by suicide more during the school year than during summer breaks or winter holidays. What is going to happen to the kids who have these more challenges when they come back to school? So after an analysis of all of these recommendations for how to proceed in establishing a comprehensive trauma-informed practices approach, these are what I considered the essential steps. Now I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think any school can implement these steps for the next school year. This is a long-term approach. And after I set forth these steps, I'm going to set forth some things that I think you can do going into the 21-22 school year. So first of all, I think we need to make a linguistic shift, which I also need to make, away from trauma-informed to increasing resilience. Establish a culturally diverse resilience leadership team that includes representatives from all staff groups, parents, and students. Representative means that they are reporting back to and receiving input from their respective communities. Assess and evaluate the level of trauma and resilience. Use a survey or surveys that are well analyzed. Include focus groups to expand on the insight and other data that you have available. And ensure an analysis of this data is based on cultural groups and other risk concerns. Identify strategies to achieve objectives that have a research rationale and are culturally appropriate within your community. This is strategies that are supported by research and adapted as necessary to fit the culture and climate of your community. Develop an evaluation plan to ensure accountability. Plan for how you will determine effectiveness of your selected strategies and/or identify the need for modification. Conduct a review of your objectives, propose strategies, and evaluation plan. Provide groups within your school community the opportunity for review and comment. I say this, and unfortunately that may have some challenges at this point in time, but this is the ideal. So for assessment, incorporate into your assessments this background data: academic achievement, disruptive behavior, disciplinary actions, including detentions and suspensions, attendance, and graduation rates. Make use of the youth risk behavior or the survey that you deliver in your state, and be sure to analyze the data based on culture, class, and poverty. Look for relationships between the data points, such as what percentage of students who were bullied report they felt unsafe coming to school or were experiencing depression. I recommend an assessment of the current levels of traumatic distress in your community. I strongly recommend not using the common ACE screener because this is not culturally accurate and focuses solely on family trauma, not school or community traumas. Consider a trauma assessment of symptoms of distress based on the DSM-5 traumatic distress disorder, and that includes how frequently are students re-experiencing, constantly reliving events, negative memories, flashbacks, nightmares. How frequently are they avoiding people and places that remind them of the traumatic incidents, emotional numbing, isolation, and withdrawal? How frequently are they having negative cognitions, persistent negative evaluations of self, others, and the world? How frequently are they hyper-aroused, easy to trigger, irritable, angry, have difficulties concentrating, and sleep challenges? And how frequently are they having distress and interference, psychosomatic illness, unable to concentrate and learn? Alternatively, given that I know of no survey that assesses based on the DSM strategies, you could do an assessment of students' current level of resilience and protective factors. The level of resilience focuses on aspects of their personal strength to handle themselves when situations get tough, And the assessment of protective factors focuses on the presence of supports in their lives, especially including relationships with trusted adults. And assess the quality of relationships between staff and students in your school. Translating this data into action. Ensure that your behavior management approach is trauma-informed and culturally responsive. Increase cultural competence throughout practices and instruction. Address the professional development needs of all staff. Provide for social and emotional learning activities and instruction. And ensure that the emotional and physical safety within the building, including establishing calming places. Increase mental health services and reduce the presence of school resource officers. Ensure a trauma-informed approach for assessment and intervention of students with challenges and those involved in disruption. Implement a comprehensive plan to reduce hurtful behavior by both students and staff. Ensure effective restorative interventions in misbehavior situations, and provide supports for staff self-care, voice, and well-being. Translate this data into action. Identify the key issues that must be addressed. Staff-student relationships so that every student has an identified staff member who is supporting them. Kindness, respect, and inclusion, that these activities need to be led by students. Self-regulation, addressed through a focus on mindfulness, self-regulation planning, and de-escalation. A strengths focus, a strategy to increase students' attention to student strengths. And problem solving, increase students' ability to engage in problem solving both independently and as a member of a team. I have these resources available. A book for teens, Be Positively Powerful, a guide for teens on achieving resilience and empowerment. A book for younger students, Be Positively Powerful, Resilient When Things Get Tough, and a Spanish translation of that book. And a 3-part video series, Engage Students to Embrace Civility. I have a student leadership program under development that focuses on using positive social norms data and emphasizes resilient when things get tough. That's my Be Positively Powerful resilience activities, and also strategies to help them build positive relationships. So I do know that I set forth a really complex and comprehensive approach to implement trauma-informed practices in the schools. So what can schools do in the 2021-22 school year? So this is hopefully the quick set of things that can be accomplished for the next school year, given the environment that we're in. Make positive connections. Absolutely use the relationship mapping approach to ensure every student feels they have a supportive relationship with several staff people. Get staff into the habit of making 5-to-1 positive to negative comments in all interactions with students. We need a significant increase in positive statements being made to students by all staff. Acknowledge everything in a positive manner. To help increase student connections, positive connections with peers, support a full range of extracurricular activities for students to get together with others, and incorporate teamwork into class projects. Establish a student leadership initiative to promote school-wide kindness. There are lots of suggestions for things they can do. Just get a diverse group of students involved and put them in charge of kindness activities. Have your students complete the VIA Character Strengths Survey. Create an image of themselves and their key strengths, and find others who share their same strengths. And incorporate this strengths focus into your overall school activities. Focus on one strength each week, as well as into community circles and problem solving. Set up a kindness and happiness gratitude board where students can post notes of appreciation for the kindness of others or something that has made them happy. Be mindful. Implement a mindfulness program that includes extended mindful meditation, transitions mindfulness activities, brief activities to achieve mindfulness whenever they enter a classroom. Movement mindfulness, set up a yoga program for the students and make sure you've established places they can go and a process they can follow to go to these places for achieving calm. Engage in a private problem-solving approach with any students that you know are more likely to trigger, to identify what things tend to trigger them and develop strategies that use their strengths that they can use when they start to trigger. Keep your personal power. Staff should positively note when they're seeing students stand tall and walk with pride or act in a positively powerful manner in any situation. That's where they need those positive comments. Help students learn that while bad things might happen, they have the ability to control how they feel about themselves and respond. This needs to be a kind of a consistent mantra or statement by staff towards students. Think things through. Incorporate problem solving into all activities, especially into community circles discussions and any restorative interventions when somebody's been hurtful or there's some kind of a challenge. And engage students in problem solving to enable them to identify strategies they can use to address any challenging situations they may be experiencing. Thank you for listening. These are my websites, embracecivility.org and bepositivelypowerful.com, with email at info@embracecivility.org.